You're in the Old Testament, and you get to the begats, you just start loving it, and you just can't wait. And when you go to the next section, you just can't wait for the next begats. Because I know you love to see, well, so-and-so lived so many years, and then he had such and such a kid, and then he lived a whole bunch of other years, and then he died, and I know you just love it. And in in Matthew's gospel, he starts off with the genealogy of Jesus. And Luke waits till the 3rd chapter to talk about the genealogy of Jesus. And so I know that this message is just going to preach itself. I'm not that delusional. I understand that when you get to a whole bunch of names, you just go, I don't get why this is here. And you jump ahead after the begats or the genealogy. So my goal in this message is to show you that there is some relevance even to you in this genealogy of Jesus. And that you might then start taking a little more interest, and the next time you come to a passage of genealogy or begats that you say, I want to look at that a little more closely. So as you know, what we're doing is we're going through the life and ministry and imperfect chronology of Jesus. But if Jesus is the Messiah, as both Matthew and Luke discuss, that genealogy is relevant because the Messiah is to come from David. Now, if you look at the two genealogies, they're slightly different. There's two possible reasons for that. One is that most people believe that the genealogy placed in Matthew is related to Joseph, and the genealogy related to Mary is related in Luke. If that's true, that's fine, because both of them will find a common point in David as their ancestor. And so the qualification of the Messiah coming from David is that. Others say that sometimes there's a difference in genealogy because there's no word for grandfather or grandson in the scriptures. And kind of to remember, it'll say like, so-and-so died and was, or slept and was laid to rest with his fathers. They never say fathers and grandfathers and whatever. And you usually only have one father. So they're using it in the general sense. So to kind of give you as an example, if we were to go backwards or forward, we could say, Joseph was the son of Joseph, the son of Joseph, the son of Joseph, the son of Jacob. Or, if we skip some people, it could be Joseph, the son of Joseph, the son of Jacob. And that's my kind of ancestry through my oldest grandson. And so we skipped a couple. The only reason that it seemed there's fewer Josephs, but the same names. And so that may be one reason that they're picking up a grandfather than whatever. But those are the things. But if you'll turn to first off, Matthew establishes that it's the heir through the presumed father of Jesus. And they both, again, like I said, state that the genealogy comes from David. That's in Luke 3:31 and Matthew 1:6. But the reason it's relevant is in 2 Samuel chapter 7. God makes a promise to David. And he says this, and when your days are completed and you lay down with your fathers, I will rise up your descendants after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. And he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him and with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness will not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and with all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. So that was the prophet speaking to David, saying, in essence, your kingdom will be established forever. And so the genealogies are going back to show that the Messiah is going to fulfill this promise. And thus far you say, well, that's great. Some scriptures and God is keeping his promise through the Messiah. But what does that have to do with me? I want to look at a few people that the genealogy discusses. And the first one I like to discuss is a king by the name of Hezekiah. Hezekiah reigned, and it says in 2 Kings 18, now it came about in the 3rd year of Hosea that the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, became king. And he was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Abi, and the daughter of Zechariah. And he did right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places and broke down the sacred pillars and cut down the Asheroth. And he broke to pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the sons of Israel burned incense to it. And it goes on and it talks about how Hezekiah kind of was a reformer, and that he was like his father David, but unlike his other fathers who were chasing after foreign gods and were offering incense and offerings to these foreign gods. And in essence, Hezekiah followed God. The reason I picked Hezekiah is because he followed God in that. And then we see later in 2 Kings that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, came and invaded Israel, and he was invading Judah. And he was trying to get the people of Judah and Jerusalem to forsake God, accept him as king, give him tribute, and everything would be wonderful. And Hezekiah prayed to God. And God said, because you prayed for deliverance of Jerusalem, I heard your words. And God himself delivered Jerusalem out of the hands of Sennacherib by slaughtering his army, and he returned to his land where he was killed there. Later in Hezekiah's life, Isaiah the prophet comes to him and says, get your house in order, because you're going to die. Hezekiah is like most of us, but I don't want to die. And so it says, he turned his face to the wall and cried and wept bitterly and prayed to God that he might not die. And before Isaiah was even halfway out of the house, God told Isaiah to turn around and tell Hezekiah that he would have 15 more years. And the interesting story of this was Hezekiah goes, well, how will I know for certain? Because you told me one thing, now you're telling me something else. And Isaiah says, the shadow can go forward 15 steps or back. You pick. And Hezekiah goes, well, going forward is kind of easy. So have it go back. And the shadow went back, which is an interesting physical miracle. Now, the sad thing about that was that God gave him 15 more years. But then Hezekiah does something kind of inappropriate. He shows the king of Babylon the treasures of his house and the house of the Lord. And because of that, God says, I'm going to give Jerusalem into the king of Babylon's hands, but I'll wait till you die. Then we hear in 2 Kings 21, it says, the next person I want to talk about, Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 55 years in Jerusalem. Now, if you do your math, if Hezekiah was supposed to die 15 years before, Manasseh would never have been born. Because Manasseh was born 3 years after he was supposed to die. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 55 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hespezad. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord according to the abominations of the nations, whom the Lord had disposed before the sons of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and and erected altars to Baal, and made an Asheroth. So we see that even though Hezekiah relied on God and followed him with all of his heart, and even though he was a great prayer warrior in the sense of he prayed 2 different things and God granted him that, his son does evil in the sight of God. But I don't want to end on a negative note as far as the kings go, so I want to look at one other king, and his name is Josiah, who is the grandson. It says in 2 Kings 22, Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Jedediah, the daughter of Adiah of Bozakath. He did right in the sight of the Lord and walked in all his ways of the father David. I find it interesting that here we have 3 different kings, one who reforms and has his heart right with God. So then you would think his son would follow in his footsteps, but instead he does evil in the sight. And it's not until the grandson of that man then does well and tries to do reforms. You see, the genealogy of Jesus is not made up of perfect kings. Matter of fact, it's made up mostly of imperfect and terrible men of. It seems that the rule is that they do evil in God's sight, and the exception is when they follow God after, as their father David did. So I want you to first understand that God uses people for his purposes regardless of who they are. But I want to drive that point home a little more in just ordinary people, because none of us are kings and queens or princes or prince. So I want to talk about 3 other people. The first one I want to talk about is a woman whose name is Ruth. Ruth, there's a book even called Ruth. And it's about a Moabite woman. A Moabite was a descendant of the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughter. And yet, Ruth will marry Boaz, who will then have a child named Jesse, will ultimately have a son named David. So what I want you to get out of this genealogy is it doesn't matter where you come from. You may come from the wrong side of the tracks. God can still use you, just as he used Ruth. There's another one. Her name was Rahab. Rahab, as the scripture says, was a harlot, or in our modern vernacular, a prostitute. But she assisted the spies when they tried to spy out Jericho. And she went with them when they defeated Jericho and resided with Israel. And she married a gentleman who then was in the line of this genealogy. So it not only doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter who you are. God can still use. God used a prostitute in his line. The last woman I want to discuss is a woman by the name of Tamar. I remember I can't say it was the first, but the first time I was actually paying attention as I read Genesis. And I came across this story, this narrative. And I thought it was really weird to have this narrative in the scriptures. And this is how the narrative goes. Judah had 3 sons. One of his sons his oldest son marries Tamar. And God does not like Judah's oldest son. So he kills him. So under the law of levirate marriage, now this is before the law of Moses. So this goes all back, like even tithes and stuff. When Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek, it's not part of the Mosaic law, but it's the part of the law of levirate, where it says that if the older brother dies, the next brother is to marry his wife and have children, but then those children would be accorded the inheritance of the brother and not yours. So the second brother marries Tamar, but he doesn't want to have his kids be accorded his dead brother's children. So, as the scripture says, he spills his seed on the ground. God's not happy with it and kills him. Judah goes, there must be something wrong with Tamar. She's like the black widow, because every time one of my kids marries her, he dies. The problem is, it's not Tamar being the bad luck. It's that these people are doing evil in the sight of God, and therefore God's taking them out. And so he has a younger son, and he tells Tamar, he's not ready, so we're going to wait a while. And basically sends her back to her father's house. And she's in mourning and is wearing widow's clothing, and time passes and time passes and time passes. Judah's wife dies, and there's a whole lot of time that passes. And after the mourning, Judah goes to shear his sheep and do some things, and Tamar hears about it, takes off her widow's clothing, puts on a veil and some clothes, and sits outside the gate. Judah, being the nice, proper man that he is, thinks she's a prostitute and wants to do with what you do with prostitutes. And she goes, how much? And he says, they do the bargain, but the sheep and whatever is not around, so he gives her some things as a pledge to show that he's going to make good on the agreement. So they have their relations, and he goes about doing his own business. And then he tries to do the honorable thing. He sends a friend out to go pay the prostitute for her services. But they can't find her. So he asks the other guys who are hanging around the streets, where's the temple prostitute? And they go, we don't have any. So the friend goes back to Judah and goes, couldn't find anyone. He goes, well, I tried to do the right thing and everything's wonderful. Again, this is a very strange story in the Bible. Not making Judah look all that great. So Judah hears that Tamar is pregnant, which means she had to have been messing around, and he thinks, so he's going to go burn her for that evil that she did. And when he confronts her, she goes, the man whose this stuff is the one that I slept with. And Judah goes, you're more honorable than me. And acknowledges that he should have given his third son according to the law, but hadn't. And that child is twins, and one of those children are one who's going to be a child who then produces a child who then produces a child who will be David. It doesn't even matter what other people think of you. They may think you're from the wrong side of the tracks. They may think you do the wrong thing. God can still use you. Now, the problem is, oftentimes we think that by being used by God means that some great miracle that we perform, or we have some awesome ministry, or that there's something that's super special. These people were in the genealogy of Jesus. Imperfect, some even evil people. Some honorable, some not. But God used each of them. But sometimes God uses us when we least suspect it. So let me give you an example. Maybe in your Christian life, you've heard people say, you need to be a good witness and evangelism, and you've heard people talk about fruit, and you're trying to produce fruit, and even though that's the wrong theological point, but you believe it, and so you're trying, and in the entire lifetime, one person comes to know the Lord because of you. And the world will say you were pretty much a failure. And we try to make ourselves feel better by saying, well, if one person is different, then it was all worth it. And let's say that one person that you led to the Lord tried all their lives to lead somebody to the Lord, and they only converted one person to the Lord. You would say, oh, gee, my ministry wasn't all that effective because I only led one person to the Lord, and that person only led one person to the Lord. But what if that one person you led to the Lord led the next Billy Graham to the Lord? Would you say that Jesus used you? There's a long genealogy. And sometimes it would be very hard to say of Tamar, oh, the world thinks that I'm a prostitute. My own family thought that whoever was related to me died. And many, many, many generations from now, the Messiah is going to come through my line. We need to have the long view of what God's doing. The point of the genealogies to me is to show you that God can use even you and even me. It doesn't matter your family background. It doesn't remember what you do. It doesn't matter what you think other people think of you. God can use you. God can use you by turning back to him. Or in the case of Pharaoh, God can use you to demonstrate his power. Because God is God. And I would rather be used as a better Hezekiah than a Manasseh. But I also understand that it is God who causes things to happen. What I need to do is be faithful and take the long view. It's not so much about what happens today, but what will God do with what I do today. He may bless me beyond measure, and I acknowledge it and see it, or that blessings may come many generations from now. But I do know that God will accomplish his purposes. And I know one day, just as those who were believers like Hezekiah saw the day that his son would be Messiah. And he will see the day, just as those who have fallen asleep in Jesus will see and come and return with him when he is declared King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So, let us get our eyes off of ourselves and off of what we can't do and what we're not of, and get our eyes on him. Because as the scripture says, with God, nothing is impossible. So much so that he can even use you. Because his grace falls like rain. His grace falls on you and it falls on me. His grace can change sinners to saints. His grace can turn ordinary men and women into extraordinary men and women. His grace can take where you are and do his will. And all God's people said,